The rows seemed endless. 89 flag-draped coffins glowed under the pale Arlington sky, each one a reminder of the price paid by the quiet and the brave. The wind whispered through the marble stones, carrying with it fragments of prayers, names, and guilt. Soldiers stood rigid, families wept in silence, and somewhere between the sound of a bugle and the beating hearts, a whisper broke through. "Someone's got to answer for this," one officer muttered, jaw tight. "They say she was supposed to stop it," another added, voice low but sharp enough to cut the air. Heads turned. Eyes followed. A single woman stood apart. Sergeant Riley Cole, hands clasped behind her back, eyes forward, posture unshaken. No ribbons, no words, just the weight of 89 names resting on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed once. She glanced down. One message. 2 words. Sentinel HQ. She didn't flinch, just straightened her cap, took one last look at the line of flags, and walked away from the graves, toward another mission waiting in the shadows. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The doors of Task Force Sentinel slid open with a hiss, spilling bright white light across the corridor. Sergeant Riley Cole stepped through, boots clicking against the polished floor. 32 years old, a former sniper from the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, she carried herself like someone who still measured every breath, every movement. The Army had discharged her months earlier after a classified operation went sideways. No one asked her what happened. No one dared. But now, they'd called her back. On the elevator ride up, she fingered the smooth edges of a small brass coin, her father's sniper coin, the only thing that survived him. Major Daniel Cole had died in Laos decades ago, a ghost mission sealed by the Pentagon. She'd grown up tracing the etching on that coin, wondering what he saw in those final seconds. Today, she'd find out why his old commander suddenly wanted her. Colonel Marcus Harlan waited inside a briefing room, built like a bunker within a fortress. LED maps alive with red blinking dots, the Rockies framed in the glass beyond. He looked older now, the lines in his face cut by loss and duty. When she entered, he gave the faintest nod of respect. "Good to see you again, Riley. I wish it were under better circumstances." He tapped the tablet. The display shifted. Montana, riddled with red markers. 6 weeks. 89 dead, all single-round headshots. No survivors, no signatures. We recovered fragments of match-grade Russian brass. Whoever's doing this isn't hunting for sport. They're testing us. A few officers around the table exchanged uneasy looks. The hum of electronics filled the silence. "We've identified the unit," Harlan continued. "An ex-KGB sniper cell called Valkyrie's Eye. All female. They work in trios. Disappear before the body hits the ground." Riley studied the pattern of kills, her gaze steady. "Extreme range engagements," she murmured. "Over 1,200 meters. They're using thermal optics and suppressed 338 Lapuas. That's not field skill. That's doctrine." Major Ethan Briggs leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading. "Doctrine? Come on, Colonel. You really think one woman can take out an entire kill team trained to vanish? We've got satellite recon and drones losing them every time." A ripple of laughter followed. Someone muttered, "Guess we're calling in the PR hero." Harlan's eyes hardened. "Enough!" Riley didn't blink. She just stared at the glowing map, her expression unreadable. On the bottom edge of the display, one red mark pulsed brighter than the rest coordinates along the northern ridge. She recognized the sequence immediately. Her father's last mission zone. The room went quiet as Harlan spoke again. "She's the only living sniper who's ever faced this kind of enemy and survived. That's why she's here." Briggs shrugged. "Or maybe she just got lucky." Riley finally looked up. "No such thing as luck, Major. Only distance and discipline." Her voice carried the calm weight of someone who'd spent nights alone in dust and silence, counting breaths between life and death. The chuckle died in Briggs's throat. Later, when the briefing ended, Riley stayed behind, eyes locked on the red marker glowing on the screen. Outside the window, snow began to fall across the Rockies. She closed her hand around the sniper coin, metal pressing into her palm. A memory flashed. Kandahar, years earlier. She'd been alone on a hill, adjusting for wind she couldn't feel, whispering the words her father once taught her, one breath, one shot. Then the world went quiet, and a life ended through a scope. Back in the present, she exhaled slowly. Quiet strength filled the space where pride should have been. Whatever ghosts waited in those Montana ridges, she would meet them the same way she met everything else, with patience, precision, and the silence only true soldiers understand. The briefing room kept its breath. Briggs paced like a man trying to fill a silence with noise, sliding sarcasm between technical slides and casualty counts. "You ever seen a woman do that kind of math at 2 clicks out?" he asked, loud enough for cameras in the back to pick up. "Or is this more of a press op? Look, we called in a legend?" A few officers snorted. Someone tapped a tablet, the sound sharp as a rifle click. The maps continued to glow red, an ugly constellation no one wanted to touch. Riley folded her hands behind her back. She listened like a man in a watchtower listens for changes in the wind. Her face did not move. Her eyes tracked the grid lines, the vectors, the men and women who would not come home without someone answering for them. Briggs jabbed a finger at the screen. "We've got drones, we've got satellites, we've got signals, intelligence. What we don't have is folklore. We don't need myth. We need results." Colonel Harlan didn't rise to the bait. He looked at Riley, then back at the room. "Results are what we ordered, Major. Riley's results are why she's here." The chuckle that had tried to build broke under the colonel's quiet. Briggs smiled thinly and leaned in. "Fine. Then let's test the myth. Ranges open tomorrow. Let her prove it." It might have been a setup, a show, something the power suits could tweet about afterward. Or it might have been the only way to cut through the noise. Riley didn't care which. She'd made a career ignoring the theater and listening for the shot. The range the next morning smelled like cold metal and fresh powder. The sun hadn't climbed, but floodlights painted the berm silver. A few dozen people were there, technical observers, logistics, a contractor with a drone feed, and Major Briggs, who carried the same old grin like a shield. They handed her an M2-10 enhanced sniper rifle. It was regulation, tuned, zeroed to a baseline but stripped of comforts. The stock felt familiar under her palm. The glass was clean, the suppressor quiet. She took it like a woman meeting an old friend, steady, unhurried, respectful. "Blindfold," Briggs said, theatrical. He wanted to make a point, and he wanted an audience while he did it. Riley nodded. She let someone tie the blindfold over her eyes, black cloth, thick enough to kill the light and thin enough to let the air through. For some, that would be panic. For her, it was theater of a more honest kind. Without sight, every other sense tightened. Hands moved like choreography. The teen gave her a mounted rifle case and a pile of empty magazines. She set the weapon down and began. She worked from memory, ritually. She unclipped the magazine catch, slid a loaded mag into place, took a practice breath, and reached for the bolt. Her fingers found the pattern bolt release, cocking, a faint whine as the firing pin locked. Every action she took was the echo of repetition, seasons on ranges, nights under blackout, 1,000 rounds in the stomach of the earth. 80 seconds was the challenge. 80 seconds to assemble, cheat the stock, and bring the rifle to firing ready. 92 seconds would have been embarrassing. 40 seconds would have looked like trickery. She moved in the rhythm she had always moved in, efficient, never rushed, deliberate. She finished well inside the limit. The blindfold came off. Briggs's face turned for the cameras. "Okay, show us the magic," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. They set the targets at varied distances, practicals, long shots, and one insane lane that pushed the envelope. Riley adjusted for wind. She checked her kestrel. She whispered a range correction, a mill adjustment, the tiny numbers men with no patience for math found boring. "Elevation," she said to no one and everyone. She scribbled dope into her pad with the pen they handed her. She dialed a minute of angle. Then another. Then a correction. Only a man who trusted his tools and his hands could make. The first group of shots was clinical. Bullseyes. Tight clusters. Each hit made the room shift, the ambient confidence of skeptics bending like a reed. 40 rounds. 40 hits, point blank. A string of bullseyes that looked almost cruel in its simplicity. The tally flashed on the screen. A technician emitted a low whistle. Then she asked for a coin, not because she needed to prove accuracy, because she liked the physics of it, the audacity. They handed her the coin, an old brass piece, pitted at the edges. She propped it on the target stand, its rim balancing on a little scotch tape dot. The crowd tried to laugh it off. Bad optics, they said, stunts. That's inside 200 meters, someone muttered, but she didn't answer. She fired a carefully measured round. The muzzle puffed. The coin trembled. Where the coin had been, now there was nothing but a clean rim. That edge had been severed and fallen away. The coin hung, half there, half gone, as if the air had taken something vital. Silence moved through the crowd, the way wind moves through a crowd of flags. No one clapped. No one cheered. They simply watched the small devastation, the kind that meant a shot measured in muscles and math, not in luck. Major Briggs swallowed, and for the first time his words sounded thin. "Okay," he admitted to a man beside him. That's not a trick. It was a turning point. The room had wanted spectacle. They got competence. The mockery had nothing to hang on now but its own echo. Riley didn't gloat. She cleaned the barrel, rechecked her scope, and sat back. Her eyes were quieter than they had been an hour ago. There was a steadiness there that did not need a crowd to prove itself. Harlan watched the exchange with the kind of look men get when they realize a decision they made might have been bigger than politics. He stood, walked to the front, and addressed the room the way a man gives an order he's thought about for years. "Major Briggs," he said, "this isn't about bravado. This is about closing a gap that has cost us lives. Valkyrie's Eye operates with tactics most of our systems can't counter. They travel light, they displace fast, and they strike at extreme ranges." Briggs crossed his arms. "We have protocols for counter-sniper. We have UAV clusters that can pattern the ridgelines. We have—" "You have numbers," Harlan interrupted, "and numbers get trapped in patterns. We need a hunter who thinks like a hunter, not like a spreadsheet. Riley's done this before where doctrine fails. That's why she's here." The room absorbed that like rain into hard ground. It was one thing to watch a demonstration, it was another to accept the implication. If the killers were as dangerous as the intel said, then small measures would not be enough. Riley listened, letting the gravity of the room reconfigure her. She thought of the graves, of the faces under flags. She thought of her father and the way he'd taught her to read a ridge, the way a carpenter reads grain, quiet, patient, knowing where to place pressure. Briggs tried one last jab. "So what's the plan? Send her up there with a camera and pray?" Harlan's face didn't change. "No. We don't send her in blind. We give her overwatch, logistics, and autonomy. We let her move like a single organism. She chooses the site, the timing, and the rules of engagement. We support. She hunts." The room shifted again. Some officers scribbled notes. Others looked at screens. The debate dissolved into logistics, vehicles, calm silence, extraction windows. Riley stood then. Her voice was low, a cut of calm through the murmur. "Permission to hunt," she said. It was concise. It was formal enough to belong in an after-action report, human enough to carry the weight of intent. It landed in the room like an unloaded bolt, simple, inevitable. Harlan nodded. "Permission granted. You'll have Sentinel resupply, overwatch from Bravo, and authority to terminate hostiles within mission parameters." Briggs's mouth found a grin that wasn't sincere. "You'll have Pratt's drones on link, and signal intercept support. You won't go off the grid without clearance." Riley met Briggs's eyes and held them steady. "I won't be on the grid." The exchange had more meaning than the words. Riley had refused to play by the same rules that had let the Valkyries slip away. She wanted the autonomy real hunters needed, to be invisible until the moment the shot mattered. They worked the plan. Maps, timing, movement vectors, weather windows. Harlan assigned a support element, and logistics moved like a body with new purpose. Men and women who had been skeptical found their roles filled. Truck drivers checking routes, communication specialists encrypting channels, intel analysts refining the kill signatures. As the logistical threads intertwined, so did the doubts. But doubts were not orders. Doubts could be put away like worn gear. Riley tested the equipment herself. She checked optics, practiced cold-bore shots, noted mirage layers, and set her dope. She adjusted for barometric pressure and altitude, wrote numbers in a little field notebook, and slid the notebook into the inner pocket of her jacket. The coin was there too, warm from her palm. When the convoy left Sentinel the next day, it carried more than vehicles. It carried a focused intent. It carried a woman whose reputation had been thrown into a room of men who preferred the comfort of numbers. It carried a chance to fix what had been broken. Permission to hunt, she had said. The words would follow her into the mountains, the long sight lines, and the ridge lines where echoes live. The cabin sat alone on a shoulder of the mountain, half buried in lodgepole pine, its roofline cut by wind and early frost. From the porch, the world fell away in folds dark timber, a ribbon of road, and the long silver thread of the border river. Riley parked the truck under a lean-to and killed the engine. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had a texture cold air, resin, and the distant scrape of branches against snow crust. She carried in a pelican case, a roll of topo maps, and a duffel that didn't rattle. Inside, the cabin was clean in the way of places no one loves. A table, a cast-iron stove, a bunk, and a nail on the wall for a coat. She set the case on the table and popped the latches. Foam parted around the M2010 like a secret. She lifted the rifle out with both hands, the old reverence returning to her grip as naturally as breath. She worked by habit. Bore snake, bolt inspection, a fingertip of oil to the lugs. She calibrated the optic, dialing brightness until the reticle sat thin and exact, neither blooming nor drowning. Then she stepped back onto the porch with a sandbag, and 3 steel plates hung at 200, 600, and 1,000 yards down the slope. The wind had a little tail from the northwest. She watched the treetops long enough to trust what they were saying. Her first cold-bore shot broke the morning. The sound ran the valley like a thread pulled taut and gone. The 200 plate rang. She recorded the dope, adjusted a click for elevation, and fired again at 6. She waited through the swaying of the metal, the slow pendulum stillness, and then touched the third shot wider out, the 1,000-yard plate shivering in the scope like a distant bell. Back inside, she spread the maps across the table, smoothing them with her forearms. Red grease pencil lines connected ridge to ridge, choke point to saddle, like tendons across a skeleton. The notes were tight and spare, wind corridors, thermal draws, blind washes where an engine could idle unheard. In the corner of one map, someone had written the designation in block letters, OP, BLA LAC. LAC-like, then underlined it twice. In a different hand, smaller, a string of numbers sat like an afterthought. She knew those numbers. She'd traced them on napkins and notebook margins since she was 12. Bay were the last coordinates from Laos, her father's last place on Earth. She pulled a photo from her jacket, the edges thinned and soft from years of riding around in pockets. Young Riley stood in the middle, eyes too serious for a child, flanked by 2 men whose faces told a story longer than their smiles, Major Daniel Cole and Captain Marcus Harlan. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, sun-browned and square. Harlan was younger then, jaw hard, a grin that hid nothing. She set the photo on top of the map, so the 3 of them looked out over the border road together. A small itch on her wrist made her glance down. The tattoo lived there where a watch would have, black ink that had softened with time. Sparrow 1. Her father's call sign. She touched it like a talisman, not for luck, but for calibration. Remember who taught you to breathe. She opened a small evidence bag that Intel had couriered up before she left Sentinel. Inside lay a single spent brass casing recovered near the third ambush site. She rolled it between thumb and forefinger, smelling the faint ghost of propellant. Under the light, she saw the deliberate cuts. Someone had etched a phrase along the body, shallow but legible, Cyrillic. She sounded it out softly, the old Russian she'd picked up in Kandahar surfacing like muscle memory. E. Hunter's sister. She placed the casing beside the photo. The words felt colder than the room. Twilight came early on the ridge. The sky slid down into blue and then into something darker, and the wind that ran the pines kept its voice. She lit the stove and warmed water in a dented pot, counting minutes as if the heat itself were a clock. The radio on the table stayed off. She was a dot that didn't want to glow on anyone's screen. After sundown, she stepped back onto the porch, scope in hand. The road below was empty except for the memory of convoys. She traced lines of sight the way carpenters trace wood grain, here a notch where the wind eddied, there a dip that murdered line of sight, over there a rock face that would heat like a radiator under morning sun. She marked each on her pad, tiny notations that meant more in her head than words could hold. Static hissed from the handset when she cracked it, a dry whisper that sounded like the wind-made teeth. She turned it down until it was just above silence. One call came through at the prearranged time. Harlan, voice low, confirming no convoy would roll until she called green. "We're honoring your window," he said. "You call the weather, we move." "Copy," she said. "Hold until I mark the eye lines." "Understood." "Riley." He paused long enough for her to picture his face. "If they're baiting you, don't bite." "I won't bite," she said, and clicked off. The lie was in the grammar. She wasn't here to bite. She was here to end a hunt by becoming the place the hunt couldn't reach. She slept in gear on the bunk for 3 hours, the kind of soldier sleep that pretends to be rest. When the watch on the shelf said 2 in the morning, she woke without an alarm and stood, joints quiet, breath level. She drank water, checked her kit, and went out into the timber. Moonlight made a geometry of trunks and shadow. She moved with her weight over the outside edges of her feet, rolling contact slow. The cold slid under her jacket and bit her wrists where gloves met sleeves. Somewhere downslope, a fox hatched the idea of a hunt and carried it silently across snow. She reached the secondary hide she'd cut in the afternoon, just a hollow behind a blowdown, braced with fresh boughs. From there, she could see 2 miles of country, the road bending out of a draw, the cut bank that would shield rotor wash, and a slab of granite bright as a skull under moon. She settled into the mist, pressed her cheekbone to the stock, and let her eye fill with glass. Time stretched, then thinned. She used it like wire. 5 minutes of wind survey became 10. 10 became 30. 30 turned into an hour, braided with small tasks, scope drift check, pulse count, graphite pencil notes on tiny changes in the pine crowns. The world did not sleep. It simply moved slower than the eye knew how to see. At 3, the wind collapsed and then shifted a hair from the east. She adjusted a quarter mil and stopped breathing, not for a shot, but for a sense. A low thrum entered the trees, more vibration than sound. It faded, came back. Faded again. Not an engine. Not something big, something in the rhythm of footfall. She waited. A flake of snow left the top of a fir and fell in a zigzag that had nothing to do with wind. The trunk below it had twitched a fraction of an inch, just enough for the branch to shrug. She kept her muzzle still and let her eyes move in their sockets, rolling slow to take in the angles. A glint peeped through the timber 50 yards right of the granite face. Not bright like glass, dim like a wet leaf. It vanished, came back for a blink. Died again. She dialed down the optic until the night got honest. The glint resolved into a shape that could have been nothing, or a lens no wider than a thumb, backed with patience. Her mouth stayed relaxed. Her finger never moved toward the trigger. She counted the seconds between glints using her pulse as metronome. Every 4th beat, a shift. Every 4th, the tiniest tremor in a pattern of absolute stillness. She made a note beside the map coordinate without lowering the rifle. Glass? Litawa, East, 3007. Disciplined. If there was one, there were probably two. If there were two, a third was watching for the one watching. Valkyrie doctrine had habits you could set your watch to. She took a long, gentle inhale and let the scope drift left in the exhale, a movement small enough to look like a tremor. 30 yards into the drift, a second shimmer blinked into being and died. North. Higher, better position. Smarter hide. They were here. Not tomorrow, tonight. The thought didn't heat her. It cooled her, the way cold water calms an engine. If they were here, they already knew she was here. The casing etched with Hunter's sister. The pattern of kills that had pressed her into the game. The bait was not the convoy. It was her. She lifted her cheek from the stock until the glass lost her eye. She listened. The wind seemed to wait too. A heavier rustle rose and stopped. 100 yards downslope, a branch released snow, and it avalanched softly into a hush. The hush had a tail, like someone had cut breath in the wrong place and then swallowed sound to hide it. She smiled at the air, a small, humorless thing. They were good. Good enough to beat drones. Good enough to make men laugh out of nerves and then shut up out of respect. She slid backward inch by inch, letting the boughs ease back into place behind her. She didn't need the shot. Not yet. She needed the angles. Back at the cabin before dawn, she warmed her hands around the stove like a civilian and wrote what she'd seen in a simple hand. Glass, East Ridge. Glass, North Spur, probable third above road bend. She sketched the arcs, the likely displacement routes, the shallow gully that would carry them when they broke contact. The drawing looked like a spider had tried to diagram its own web. She pulled the evidence casing back to her palm and turned it so the Cyrillic caught the light. Hunter's sister. It wasn't a taunt. It was a claim. She looked at the photo. Her father's hand on her shoulder. Harlan's smile that day in the sun. She hadn't known yet what she would become. He had. A daughter who learned quiet as a weapon. She stepped to the doorway and watched the sky lift itself toward day. The wind combed the pines in long, slow strokes. The radio on the table gave a whisper of static, and then, as if the mountains themselves had decided to speak, went quiet again. They knew she was here. She knew where they were. The border road below lay empty, innocent as a child's idea of danger. In an hour, the light would change everything. In an hour, the mirage would rise off the granite and turn glass into smoke. She set her hand on the rifle and felt the cool of the metal in her skin. The hunt had shifted. The lines had crossed. The old equation her father taught her settled into place. The hunter was not alone on the ridge anymore. The hunted had found her first, and that was fine. It just meant the game would be honest when it finally began. Dawn came thin and silver, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything. Riley lay prone in the secondary hide she'd cut the day before, face pressed to the stock, breath slow enough to disappear. The valley below felt suspended river muted, frost still gripping the grasses, wind moving only at the tops of the trees. She let the scope drift along the ridge she'd marked in the night and waited for the world to admit it was awake. They appeared like true professionals do, without announcement, without drama, only the faint disturbance of a pattern. Two figures ghosted into view on the eastern spur, 1,200 yards out, moving in wedge formation with the casualness of people who have rehearsed fear out of their bodies. They carried long rifles wrapped in burlap and a roll of netting, and they moved with the patience of rain. The angles were textbook. One shooter set her body behind a rock knuckle that gave a clean slice of the road. The other chose a shallow scrape 10 meters higher, aperture cut for a rear quarter shot. Between them, a killing lane that would pull a convoy's attention left while the real fire came from somewhere else. It was good work, too good to be where it was. Riley felt the thought before she thought it. Too easy. She let the reticle idle on the lower woman's shoulder seam, as if choosing wind, then drifted off the pair and climbed the slope with her glass, slow enough to look like daydreaming. Elevation buys truth. The shoe that doesn't show mud is the foot that matters. Her father's voice, remembered in the bones more than the ear, guided the optic higher. There, the faintest glint, a thread of light no wider than a needle's eye. It came from the high spine 150 meters above the decoy pair, backlit by a low angle of sun. It wasn't a scope flash you'd write about. It was the kind of tired shimmer metal gets when it's been in the cold too long. The movement around it was negative space, an absence where there should have been a snag of brush. Riley moved the rifle a hair and breathed once, twice. The pattern resolved. 2 bodies in a single burrowed hide, overwatch for the decoys below. The upper team had the elevation, the windbreak, and the escape route. The lower pair would take the credit and the first return fire. "Nice try," she murmured, and let her heart slow until the scope no longer floated. She indexed her dope 1,050 meters to the lower shooter, wind quartering left to right at 3 miles per hour between gusts. Cold bore had already been paid for earlier. The barrel temperature was honest now. She dialed the minute corrections with fingertips, not the whole hand, and snugged the sling against the inside of her elbow until the rifle and her pulse were a single clock. The first shot broke like a held breath. The lower decoy folded behind the rock knuckle without theatrics, as if a string had been cut somewhere out of sight. The second decoy, trained well enough to know that movement kills, didn't jerk. She tried to sink flatter into the scrape. Riley rode the recoil back into the pocket, kissed the trigger a second time, and the second woman went still. 2 seconds for the pair. 9 seconds left for the real problem. Riley slid her cheekbone a fraction, climbed elevation, and found the overwatch nest again with the calm of repetition. The upper team had done what smart people do. They didn't panic. One shifted, a flat ripple, probably reaching for a spotting scope. The other held steady with the muzzle already indexed into the killing lane where the convoy would someday be. Cool professionals. Brave and doomed. She didn't center mass. She went just off center, separating the 2 bodies by a thumb's width in the glass so that recoil would carry from one to the other without her needing to muscle anything. Wind gave her a gift, a momentary lull that simplified the math to the barest truth of distance and gravity. She let time stretch until it felt like water. 2 more shots spoke in one continuous memory. The first cut the spotter mid-turn. The second took the shooter's hinge at the base of the skull, where motion plans end and gravity finishes the job. The rifle settled. The valley exhaled. 11 seconds, give or take, the kind of time you lose in adrenaline. Riley didn't celebrate. She listened. Sound returns in layers after violence. First, the tiny sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the high thread of a jay. Then the ones from farther away, river gossip, distant crackle of ice softening on stone. Under all of it, like a message written under another message, came the faintest wash of encoded speech. She rolled off the rifle and drew a small receiver from her chest rig, an SDR she'd tuned to the band. Their forensic guys said the Valkyries liked. The signal sat there like a patient shark, quiet until it wasn't, then a brief flutter, then quiet again. She lifted the antenna and let the mathematics in the box argue with the mathematics in the trees. The audio that came out was compressed, clipped, Russian hammered into small, efficient corners of sound. She didn't need a full sentence to understand the meaning. Artemis. A single code name slipped between bandwidth like a coin sliding under a door. Then the hiss sealed it again. Riley's lip twitched. It wasn't a smile. The name wasn't new to her. Artemis had lived in her research notes as myth and math for months. The woman who coordinated, who designed traps that taught doctrine, who cleared trails like a chess player takes space. You ever had to fight someone you couldn't even see? She would have put the question to the camera if there had been one. Instead, she offered it to the scope, to the frost, to the quiet shape of the mountain. Most people fear the shot they can hear. The smart ones fear the one that happens without a sound, from someone who knows you better than you hope you know yourself. She didn't move fast. Speed is appetite. Appetite gets you killed. She backed out of the hide 1 inch at a time, re-wreathed the hole with boughs, and let the needles settle on her hood like approval. Then she broke the line of her approach, never retracing the path that had brought her here. She took a stupid route on purpose, a clumsy traverse through deadfall and crust that said, "Rookie," to anyone watching. If Artemis had glass on her, let her glass see carelessness, make her underestimate. Make her choose the wrong angle. 10 minutes later, she slid into a tertiary nook she'd cut under a rock shelf and brought the rifle up again. The decoy hide below was still. The overwatch mist was a quiet wound in the snow. Heat would keep those bodies soft for a while, but the story they told was already cooling. She didn't love having to move forward to confirm, but intel lives in the places you don't want to go. She waited another 15 minutes for a second signal break on the band. One burst came, short, impatient, an exchange at the edge of discipline. She couldn't make it out. She didn't need to. They were repositioning the way doctrine says you should: fan, reset, kill box with new geometry. She marked likely egress routes, then crawled. The overwatch burrow was everything a manual would endorse. Low silhouette, good drainage, a defensive lip to break a silhouette. The two women inside were not caricatures. They were professionals who'd trained harder than most men ever would. Riley eased in without touching their gear more than she had to. She collected the charted dope with its little weather notes, barometric pressure in pencil, slope angles scribbled with competent haste. The handwriting was small and neat. She recognized the pattern of someone who takes comfort in numbers. Under a folded poncho liner, she found the patch. It was velvet black with old thread, the kind of unit insignia you don't wear openly. A winter bird embroidered in silver, stylized, perched on a thin branch that clawed at nothing. Petrov. Academy curved above it in Cyrillic, the letters archaic and proud. When she touched it, she could feel the small grit of a life lived in rain and cold and dust. She slid the patch into an evidence bag and kept working. Their kit was standard, spare mags, water in flat canteens that wouldn't glint, an oily rag that smelled like home to anyone who's loved rifles too long. In the bottom of the pack, nested in a pocket that had been cut open and restitched, lay a tiny tin box. It looked like something a grandmother would have kept buttons in. She popped it with her thumbnail. An old Soviet badge lay inside, enameled dulled but intact. The hammer and sickle sat over a wreath. The red had faded toward rust. Across the back, someone had etched initials into the metal, once clear as a declaration. Now those letters had been scratched out with a knife, deeply, deliberately, until they were a scar no file could polish smooth. D.C., she read faintly under the damage. Daniel Cole. The breath she didn't know she'd been holding left without sound. It felt less like shock and more like the click of a puzzle piece you had hoped wouldn't fit, and did. She turned the badge in the dull light, the etched wound catching and losing the morning in turns. It could be theater. It could be a planted taunt. But no one who had met the discipline of these women would accuse them of cheap theater. If they wanted to say something, they said it in work. Artemis had sent a message, not to the United States as a country, not to Task Force Sentinel, to Riley, daughter of a man whose last coordinates lived in the same handwriting on another map. Hunter's sister. She put the badge back the way she'd found it, but she didn't leave it there. She slid it into her inner pocket beside the sniper coin and closed the zipper with the softest sound. Two histories, brutal and beautiful, sat together for the first time. One that had raised her, one that had tried to erase him. Below the overwatch nest, a grouse exploded from brush and thundered away in a panic that felt staged. Riley froze. Movement followed sound in most human nervous systems, yes, even hers. She forced herself to settle, to let the small storm of feathers do its work without making her do hers. If Artemis was reading her, she would be reading for impulsiveness. She would be looking for appetite. A minute later, a new glint appeared low in the timber where glints shouldn't be too far downslope, too obvious. A mirror, probably. A cheap trick to pull a lens. When it flashed again, the angle was wrong for some. Someone was shining it. Riley let it flash a third time. Then she moved an inch to change the parallax and let the mirror flash fall out of the world. Whoever had held it got nothing back. The mountain returned to the endless labor of being a mountain. The radio hissed, coughed, and let another clipped message breathe out. Artemis, North Spur reset vector, then gravel. Then nothing. If they were using brevity codes, the word was either a rally point or a person. Either way, the cadence told her more than the content. They were calm, annoyed, not panicked. They had lost more than they wanted and less than they feared. Professionals. She took one last look at the decoy hide, checked that the weapons were dead, and ghosted back toward the cabin on a path that looked like it had been chosen by water, not by a person. Every 20 steps she broke her own pattern, then broke the break, tiny feints against a reader who would assume she was good and would be right. The cabin's cold greeted her like a comrade who doesn't hug. She shut the door without letting the latch click, slid the rifle into the stand, and unrolled the map across the table again. Red grease pencil lines met her notes and shook hands with them. She added new arcs, penciled in the real Overwatch site, and circled a spine beyond it where a commander would sit if she needed to see everything. North Spur. The word from the radio had a body now. On the table, the casing with the Cyrillic stared up at her. She put the Petrov patch beside it. The pairing looked like a family portrait you didn't want guests to see. Her thumb found the sniper coin without being told to. Warm metal, edges worn smooth by years of hands. She thought of her father's face in the photo, and then the scarred initials on the back of the badge. Some men teach you how to breathe. Some men try to steal the air. Outside, a gust shouldered the cabin, and the roof timbers answered. She closed her eyes and let the sound roll through her bones. The mountain was still speaking. The hunt had room left in it. She keyed the hamset once and kept her voice low. Sentinel, Sparrow 1. 4 hostiles neutralized, confirmed decoy pair and Overwatch element. Intercepts reference, Artemis. Recommend pushback convoy window. I'm marking new arcs for North Spur. Over. Harlan's reply came clean. Copy, Sparrow. Your call on timing. We'll hold until you say go. Stay dark. We're not the only ones listening. She clicked off and didn't sign. She wasn't interested in making a sound just to hear one back. She cleaned the rifle as you dress a wound, methodically, without rush, without letting hands show the head what they feared. Then she holstered quiet and stood at the window. Pines bowed and rose, a congregation worshiping something colder than God. The first strike had begun. It had not ended anything. It had brought the enemy into view in a way that numbers never do. They had a name now, Artemis, and a school, and a lineage that bled into her own. Riley let the quiet settle around her like a cloak and tried the weight of the next choices in her mind. The ridge to the north. The likely rally. The place she could take away the angles they wanted and make them ask bad questions. The badge in her pocket pressed flat against the coin. She wasn't sentimental, but she understood the gravity of old metal and older promises. Her father had taught her that distances weren't just math, they were also history. The bullet doesn't only cross space, it crosses time between what was done to you and what you will refuse to let be done to others. On the far slope, a crow landed on a dead tree and said whatever it is crows say when the living and the dead trade places for a little while. Riley nodded at the bird like it had passed along a message she already knew. She rolled the map shut, stowed the patch, and slung the rifle. The mountain held its breath. The next move belonged to the person who could wait longer. Riley opened the door and stepped back into the cold. Fog rolled up from the river like a tide that had lost its way. It pooled in the low cuts and slipped around the trees, softening the edges of everything until the ridge looked half-remembered. Riley moved along the spine 1 inch at a time, weight low, breath pacing with the wind. Her world shrank to glass and muscle memory and the quiet tally of places a person could hide. The valley below was a curtain. The curtain had hands. She kept to the shadowed side of a hooded rock and eased the rifle along the lip until the scope could read the next piece of ground. 30 yards. 50. 100. The fog worked like a veil between frames of a film lift, reveal, swallow. In the second frame after a lift, a shape became a person. Email. Alone. Kneeling beside the stump of a fallen pine, as if it were an altar, no mask. Calm in a way that wasn't bravado, Riley's cheek found the stock. The crosshair settled, not because she wanted it to, but because years had trained it to. The woman's eyes lifted before the scope fully owned her. "You hunt well, sister," she said in English, so clean it could have been Midwestern. The words didn't startle Riley. The voice did. It was soft. Not warm. Precise in the way a scalpel is precise. She let the barrel hold steady and let her lungs do what lungs do. "What did you call me?" The woman didn't move her hands. She slid her gaze to a small pouch at her knee and opened it slowly, telegraphing each motion the way professionals do when they don't want to die for a misunderstanding. She drew out a plastic-sleeved photograph and held it up between two fingers. Fog thinned enough to make the image readable through glass. A younger woman stood between two men in a sun so bright it made everything squint. The younger woman was very pregnant. Her smile was shy and tired and beautiful. One of the men was Anton Petrov. Riley knew his face from 100 files and 1,000 nightmares. The other man wore no uniform. His hand rested lightly on the younger woman's shoulder in a way that was too intimate for a stranger and too careful for a husband. Riley did not feel the ground shift. She felt the past move under her like ice cracking. "My mother," she said. It wasn't a question. It came out like the fact it was. Elena Petrov, because there was no point pretending she was anyone else, lowered the photo as if returning a relic to its place. "And mine," she said. "Before she married your father, she loved mine, or believed she did." The border is never just a line on a map. The wind pushed fog along the ridge and made the dead pine whisper. Riley tracked the motion instinctively, then returned to Elena's face. It was not a face that welcomed pity. High cheekbones. Eyes the color of snow that has decided to turn back into water. A hardness that suggested a girl who learned early that softness cost too much. "You killed Major Daniel Cole," Riley said quietly. "Your father—" Elena's mouth curved a half millimeter. Not a smile. The acknowledgement of a shared story. "Not me, he did. I was 9. Later I learned the file our side kept. Later I learned your side's version too. Later I learned the part that didn't make it into either." She held the photo up again, then eased it back into the pouch. "She is the part everyone forgot to record. The part that made us sisters whether either nation wished it." Riley didn't lower the rifle. She didn't feel the urge to. The rifle wasn't there for argument. It was there for gravity. "Why the graves?" she asked. 89 Americans. Soldiers. Children. Why make them pay for something 2 men did and 1 woman survived? Elena's eyes didn't flinch. "The graves were not the lesson," she said. "The lesson was that your machine bleeds. It can be made to remember the people it forgets. I wanted your commanders to say names. I wanted you to come." "Me," Riley repeated, as if the word could be examined from different angles and make more sense. "You," Elena said. "Because you learn patterns, and you are not afraid to break them. Because your father taught you to breathe through grief, and men like Briggs do not know how to see a woman who does that. Because your mother once stood on a dirt road between 2 men and chose a harder life than either offered her." Riley let the muzzle drift a centimeter, not enough to fail the moment. Enough to let her neck stop arguing with steel. "So you built a war to write a family letter." Elena didn't rush to reject the cruelty of the frame. She let it sit between them until it looked a little too small for what really lived in her eyes. "I built a lesson to end another war someone began before we were born. I built a test, and I left you threads because I wanted the one person who could kill me to do it, knowing why." Her finger moved. Fog bunched and tore. The ridge sharpened and softened, sharpened and softened. Somewhere below, the river took a breath, and forgot to exhale. Riley's hands didn't sweat, her pulse didn't sprint. The room she was in was the same room she had always been in when things mattered, a narrow, honest place where math held hands with mercy. "Artemis," she said, using the name Elena's people used. "You made decoys. You built Overwatch. You wrote messages in brass. Why this? Why take off the mask and hand me a photo no court can verify?" Elena's shoulders lifted and fell the smallest amount. "Because I wanted the last sound my soldiers heard to be the truth, not doctrine. They knew why they fought. They did not know why I fought. Now they do." She tilted her head, listening to the mountain in a way Riley recognized. "Also because I did not wish for your bullet to travel blind." Riley could have put the rifle down and crossed the space and taken the photo with her hands. She could have asked for names and dates and the kind of specifics lawyers and historians use to make rooms feel clean. She did none of that. Clean rooms are for people who get to live after the story ends. "My mother never spoke his name," Riley said quietly. "Not once. She spoke my father's every day, even when he was gone. She taught me to shoot under a sky that didn't forgive. She taught me that a person can be two things and still be one person if they don't lie about it." Elena's mouth moved again around that not smile. "Then we had some of the same education." Silence opened and did not close. It wasn't awkward. It was weight-bearing. Wind pressed hard enough to make the fog lean. For a brief moment, the ridge clarified. 2 women, 2 rifles, 30 yards of frozen earth, a dead pine, an old argument older than both of them. Riley could see Elena's weapon angled off to the side, safety on, not abandoned, not pointed at the sky. A compromise between respect and readiness. "You could leave," Riley said. "You could walk into the mist, and I could pretend the ground swallowed you. You could bury the badge and the patch and the words and crawl back into a border that doesn't ask for surnames." Elena breathed through her nose, the exhale a pale thread that the fog took care of. "No, I chose a road. Roads are for walking to the end." She studied Riley the way a cartographer studies negative space. "Do you understand the only kindness I can offer you?" "Tell me," Riley said, though she already knew. "That you do not have to shoot an unarmed woman," Elena said, and reached slowly for her rifle. "You have to shoot a sniper who returned her finger to the safety and turned the muzzle away and then turned it back towards you." Her thumb rested on the lever still. "So there is no rumor, so no one says later that the American killed a penitent." "I am not penitent. I am finished." Riley let the scope drift off Elena's eye to her shoulder, and then to the seam of her jacket, and then to the place above the heart where fabric wrinkles differently on left and right. She thought of the badge in her pocket, the scar carved across her father's initials, the coin warm against cold skin. She thought of the phrase, etched into brass, "Hunter's sister." "I don't want to hate you," Riley said. It felt like a confession she owed to someone whose name the fog had lost. "I don't know if I have the right to." "You have the right to do your work," Elena said, "and I have the right to stand still while you do it." She lifted the rifle and let it settle toward Riley the way you settle a tired animal, steady, unafraid, resigned without being broken. "This is where it ends. Not because a machine told us. Because we agreed." Riley's world narrowed to the ring of glass and widened to include every voice that wasn't in the air. The bugle at Arlington, Harlan's tired silence, Briggs swallowing his own certainty, her mother's hands on a kitchen table when the bills were too many and the days too long. She placed the crosshair where training and mercy meet. The place a person leaves from quickly. The wind went slack for the length of one slow count. She breathed in, breathed out, and left a little air at the bottom like her father had taught her. The trigger broke the way it always did when all the math stopped arguing. One shot. Elena rocked once like a woman who had remembered a friend's name and then sat down. The fog hurried in to cover what the air no longer needed to look at. Her rifle slid, tipped, and rested its muzzle in the old pine duff as if returning a tool to storage. Riley did not move for a long time. The mountain had the dignity of the newly quiet. When she finally crawled forward, she did it without the rifle shouldered, hands open, the way you approach a history that has run out of pages. Elena's eyes were still. Her mouth had that half-millimeter curve that could have been pain or acceptance or the answer to a question no one else would hear. Riley touched the pouch at her knee and removed the photo. She looked at it under a sky that had decided to be gray for the rest of the day. The younger woman between two men wasn't smiling anymore. Or maybe Riley's hand shook and made the world ripple. She folded the photo once and slid it into her own pocket beside the coin and the badge. Not because evidence needed collecting, because witnesses are rare on ridges like this, and someone had to remember the exact shape of what happened. Wind returned in a low, even push. A crow called once from a bare snag and then thought better of it. Riley lifted her face to the cold and let it sting. "This ends here," she had said, and it had. One shot, one silence. The fog closed its hand, the ridge exhaled. And somewhere far below, the river carried the news to stones that did not care and to roots that did. They heard the shot from a mile out and didn't know what it meant. By the time the rotary thunder of the Black Hawk crested the ridge, the fog had thinned to rags. The helicopter settled low, rotors licking the treetops, snow dust lifting like ghosts around the skids. A chalk of rangers fanned through the timber, methodical, rifles low and eyes high, that sacred choreography of after-action and aftermath. Riley didn't move to meet them. She stood where she'd been since the world went quiet, rifle slung, hands open at her sides, looking at the woman she had killed. There was nothing triumphant in her stance. Only the stillness of work finished, clean, exact, without gloating. Colonel Harlan stepped off the bird before the rotors fully bled down. His face had that winter-hardened look leaders get when the news they carry is half relief and half grief. He moved through the cordon with small nods to his people, then stopped 3 paces from Riley. He didn't speak at first. He took in the scene the way a father takes in a truth already decided, eyes scanning the ground, the angles, the last position of the fallen. Elena Petrov lay as Riley had left her, rifle at a respectful angle, the fog coming and going like a curtain that couldn't decide if the show was over. Near the dead pine stump, Riley had placed 2 objects on the bark, a black velvet patch with silver thread, the winter bird of the Petrov Academy, and, beside it, the dull and faithful circle of her father's sniper coin. Harlan saw the patch, then the coin. Then Riley's face. He didn't ask for a report. He squared his shoulders, heels together, and brought his hand to the brim of his cap. The salute rose crisp and unhurried, a line drawn between the living and the dead. It was not performative. It was the plainest thing he had to give. Riley held his eyes, then dipped her chin a fraction, an acknowledgement without vanity. She did not raise a hand. He was the commander. She was the shooter. The ridge already knew its hierarchy. One by one, the rangers followed. A ripple of right hands, palms flat, brims cut against pale light. No one tried to talk over the mountain. No one filled the air with congratulations. The salute was the whole language. Briggs arrived on the second bird. Even at a distance, Riley could read the argument still happening inside his bones. He came up the slope with a stiffness that wasn't cold. When he reached the ring of men, he stopped. His gaze moved from the body to the patch to the coin to Riley. Whatever he meant to say fell apart before it reached his mouth. He lowered his eyes. Evidence techs approached like surgeons, gloved and deliberate. They bagged the patch and logged the rifle, measured distances, snapped photos that turned blood and fog into pixels. Harlan waited until they finished and then nodded toward the stretcher team. The body would go home the same way every soldier goes home carried, so the ground couldn't keep anything that didn't belong to it. Riley picked up the coin last and slid it back into her pocket. It tapped against the Soviet badge and the folded photo like a small bell. She closed her hand around the sound and put it away. "Report when you're ready," Harlan said quietly. "I'm ready," Riley answered. She gave it to him in the language the Army respects. Concise, chronological, unemotional. 4 hostiles, decoy pair at 1,050 meters, Overwatch element neutralized, encrypted chatter referencing Artemis, rally on North Spur. Final contact on Ridgeline. Mask off. Verbal exchange. One shot confirmed. Any doubt? Harlan asked. None, Riley said. She chose the end. Harlan's jaw shifted like a man trying to keep two truths in his mouth at once. Understood! They lifted off with the ridge growing small and steadied in the doorway. Riley watched the trees slide under the skids in long, dark bands. She didn't look back to memorize the exact place. Some places do not need a map to be remembered. The flight back was all rotor and headset crackle. Briggs sat across from her, seatbelt biting into his harness, hands in fists that weren't about anger anymore. Twice he started to speak. Twice he didn't. Riley closed her eyes and rode the vibration through her chest until it was just another kind of heartbeat. Sentinel HQ met them with evening light and the antiseptic smell of a facility that lives on coffee and worry. They moved through the airlock and down the corridor to a debrief room that had hosted too many stories that start with, "It went south." A single camera blinked red on the wall. A recorder sat on the table like a conscience. Harlan took the head of the table. Riley sat to his right. Briggs stood in the doorway like a man not yet invited into a church. "Let's make it clean," Harlan said. "No speculation beyond what the evidence can shoulder." Riley placed 3 items on the green pad in front of her. The Petrov patch, sealed and labeled. The Soviet badge, scuffed and scarred where initials once were. The photograph, edges softened by travel. Harlan's eyebrows lifted a millimeter. He took in the badge first, read the damage, then let his gaze move to the photo with the weight of a man who knows some paperwork is not meant for clerks. "We'll handle these with discretion," he said. He didn't say classified. It was already understood. Riley debriefed. She told the truth without embroidery. She did not sand the edges off the part where Elena called her sister. She did not insert anger to make the narrative easier to carry. She spoke quietly and let silence do some of the work. The recorder clicked louder for a moment, as if even electronics needed to clear their throat. When she finished, Harlan pressed his palms together, fingers steepled. He looked older than he had on the ridge. The burden of victory is heavier when it walks in wearing a familiar face. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. "This is the kind of report I wish didn't need writing." He turned his head toward the doorway. "Major Briggs!" Briggs stepped in. The room had the stillness of an undisturbed pond. He came to attention, boots kissing the floor with a sound that could have been a promise or an apology if you believed in translating noises into meaning. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" he said, eyes locked straight ahead. Riley might have smiled in another life. In this one she just said, "Granted." Briggs swallowed once. All the sarcasm he used like body armor had been set down somewhere between the ridge and this room. "I was wrong," he said. Each word carried its own weight, separate and whole. "About your record." "About what we needed." "About you," he saluted. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't theatrical. It was clean and exact, his palm aligned with the brim of his cap, that small, lovely geometry of respect. Riley returned it. Then she let her hand fall and nodded once, a gesture without ornament. "Acknowledged," she said. "Because there is dignity in not making a man bleed more than he has to in front of others." Briggs' shoulders loosened as if something long coiled had finally exhaled. He didn't ask to justify his earlier words. He didn't get credit for honesty. What he got was the chance to be a soldier again. Word moves through a facility faster than any official memo. By the time Riley walked the corridor to the operations bay, people had stepped away from screens and out of doorways. No one clapped. No one tried to catch her eye with platitudes. Engineers straightened. Analysts stood. A logistics sergeant shifted his coffee from his right hand to his left so he could bring his knuckles to his brow. It looked like a wave breaking without noise, respect rolling down a hallway. Harlan said nothing, and by saying nothing, taught everyone how to behave. He walked at Riley's shoulder and let the salute speak for him when they reached the central map wall. He raised his hand again, less for her, more for the dead. "For the 89, he said, voice so low it almost didn't make it across the tile. "For the 89, the room answered, not in chorus, not like a chant, but like a shared breath. In the corner, the comm screen cycled through feeds. A quiet ticker line showed something that would stay inside these walls. OP Bialak light deferred. Beneath it, a word the external world would never hear but the people here would carry into dinner and sleep. SA safe. Riley moved to the sideboard where the memorial display lived. A shelf of names etched into small steel plaques, a framed flag, a shadow box with pins. Nobody wore anymore because the people who owned them were elsewhere. She took the Soviet badge from her pocket, looked at the scar where her father's initials had been, and placed it in the shadow box with a care that felt like a prayer. The symbol didn't belong to them. The scar did. It said a wound had tried to overwrite a name and failed to erase the memory. She didn't add the photo. That stayed in her pocket. Some truths are for the mountain and a kitchen table, not for glass. On her way out, a young specialist stopped awkwardly, boots skidding a little on the waxed floor. "Ma'am," he started, then abandoned the rest and gave her that small, shy nod soldiers give when they're trying not to drown in their own awe. Riley spared him from words. She tapped the table once with her knuckles as she passed, that quiet infantry knock that means, "I see you." Keep going. In the mess, conversation leaned around her like tall grass yielding to a wind it respects. No one crowded her. Someone slid a coffee to her place without asking. She wrapped her hands around the heat and stared out the window at the mountains she had learned as a second language. The coffee tasted like bitterness that had finally remembered how to be warm. Later, alone in the locker room, she sat on a wooden bench with the coin in her palm. Its edges were smooth from generations of worry. She thought of Elena's last look, not as an enemy, not as a friend, but as a living answer to a question both sisters had inherited. The room hummed with air vents and the faint mechanical click of a timer she could not see. She exhaled until the air ran out without turning into speech. She went back to the debrief room to sign the paper that makes stories real. Arlen waited with the pen and the tired smile of an officer who will never get used to asking the brave to carry impossible things. "You did what only you could do," he said. "I did my job," Riley answered. He nodded. "And you did it without letting the job eat you. That's rarer than we admit." On the way to the exit, Briggs caught up again. "Ma'am," he said, falling into step, "if you ever need me on your line, if you ever need another man to hold a ridge, say it. I won't talk. I'll just be there." Riley looked at him for the half-second you give someone when you want them to understand you mean it. Understood. Outside, the evening had gone the color of steel that's been washed too many times. The flag over Sentinel snapped once and then remembered how to hang. Riley stood at the edge of the lot and watched the light leave the Rockies. The last edges of snow burn dull and then go gray. She could feel the story adjusting inside the people who had witnessed it, disrespect giving way to the only currency that matters in rooms like these. And just like that, the mockery that began this story turned into reverence. Because respect isn't given, it's earned in silence. In a coin pressed into a palm. In a salute held a breath longer than regulation. In a room that forgets how to breathe for a moment because what they're seeing deserves that space. The mountain had kept its part. Riley had kept hers. The rest was paperwork and memory, and the steady work of people who would never again laugh at the idea that one quiet professional could change the shape of a war. The investigation came together slowly, the way all ugly truths do, first in rumors, then in paperwork. Analysts traced shell companies, offshore accounts, and encrypted transfers until one name refused to stay buried: Howard Brennan, the same tech magnate who had once funded Riley's scholarship back when she was a kid, who believed in clean motives and long shots. His plan had been simple, cruel, and profitable. If he could make the U.S. military look weak, crippled by a wave of sniper assassinations, contract panic would follow. Private defense firms like his would sweep in to stabilize the crisis. Every fallen soldier had been an entry on a ledger. When Riley read the file, she didn't curse. She just sat back in the debrief chair and let the paper edges cut into her fingers until they drew a thin red line. The coin in her pocket felt heavier than brass. Her father had taught her that every trigger pulled has two ends. Brennan had never learned that lesson. By the time the FBI sealed his accounts and the news called it corporate espionage turned domestic terror, Riley was gone from the building. She didn't want a press conference. She wanted quiet ground. Arlington waited. Rows of white headstones catching late sunlight, flags whispering in an October wind. She walked the length of the section until she found the markers for the 89 names she'd memorized during the investigation. She knelt beside the first row, coin between her fingers, the metal warm from her palm. She placed it on a headstone without ceremony and whispered, "Hunt's over, Dad." No one answered, and that was right. Some conversations don't need an echo. She stood there until the sun went low enough to wash the marble gold. A bugle sounded somewhere distant, the same few notes that had begun this story. They didn't hurt now. They just meant that the day had done its duty. She didn't seek glory, only closure. Some battles are fought with bullets, others with silence, and the quiet professionals, the ones who carry both, rarely make headlines. They simply go home, polish the rifle, and make sure the next shot never needs to be fired. From the shadows of Arlington to the ridges of Montana, Sergeant Riley Cole proved that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks alone, steady, patient, unshaken. She showed the world that courage can whisper, that justice doesn't always roar. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come.